listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and today on the program, I'm going to be breaking down the U.S. Podcast Advertising Revenue Study that was just released by the IAB. IAB stands for Interactive Advertising Bureau, and each year the IAB puts together an upfront event in New York City where there are advertisers and content creators that come together and talk about opportunities within the podcast space. During that event, the IAB releases this revenue study. The revenue study really, in my opinion, is a very important piece of the industry. It's something that the IAB has been doing for 7 years now, and it gives us a really good picture of where we have been and where we are going. They break down a lot of factors as it pertains specifically to revenue. Now, they open the report by saying that overall digital advertising is slowing, right? That we're seeing a slowing economy and we're seeing a pullback in advertising and marketing spend. However, despite these factors, US podcast ad revenue showed resilience by growing 26% year over year to $1.8 billion. Now, I have heard people in the industry say that we have hit $2 billion. Obviously, this report shows that we haven't quite hit $2 billion, but we certainly will get there soon. They go on to say that, in fact, podcasting continues to be one of the fastest growing digital channels, outpacing the total internet ad market. So that's pretty incredible, right? So the internet market in terms of just overall digital advertising was up by 11%, but podcast advertising was up by 26%. So pretty dramatic, right? One of the things that they say is, why is this happening, right? What is driving this revenue? And the first piece is that listenership continues to really grow and expand. There's more diversity. The total time spent listening is increasing. And really, there's this authentic content that is really aligning well with niche interests and topics that is continuing to propel listenership and continue really to grow that connection and the engagement in podcasting, which is super important. Podcast creators are really meeting consumer demands in the production and increasingly distinct and engaging content, right? So we've got this continued expansion in growth, continued expansion in content, which we have seen. And really, because of the two of those, advertisers across multiple ad categories are increasing ad spend. So that is obviously the most important piece, is that we're seeing advertisers really flocking to the podcast ad space. They go on to mention that revenues are projected to more than double between 22 and 25 to $4 billion. So between 2022 and 2025, we can expect to see $4 billion in ad sales in podcast advertising, which is pretty incredible. So one of the things that I want to bring up that I thought was interesting is that we did see a slowdown. Certainly at True Native Media, we saw a slowdown specifically in Q4 of 2022. Typically, Q4 is going to be a banner quarter, right? Because of the holidays, and that's when people tend to place a lot of ad spend. And I would say for us, we were, going gangbusters. Everything was going really well. And then all of a sudden, kind of around Q4, really toward the end of Q3, it was like somebody kind of was applying the brakes. And we kind of looked around and we're like, oh no, what's happening? What's going on? Why are we seeing a bit of a slowdown? And the report does say that Q4 share of revenue fell by 29%. It was the lowest level seen in the last 6 years. So I find that really fascinating, because obviously the report is saying that we're going to be increasing, getting up to this $4 billion in annual sales. But we also saw a slowdown in Q4 of 2022. And this report is focusing on all of the revenue that happened in 2022, because obviously we can't fully study 2023 yet because we're still in the middle of the year. So it'll be really interesting, I think, to take a look at the report from next year and see where things are. I would say anecdotally, And, just looking at what we're seeing at True Native Media, I feel like things are increasing. Q1 was a little slower than maybe we would have liked, but we definitely are seeing an increase in placements. And as a company, we are still up significantly year over year, which is great. As far as I understand in talking to other companies as well, everyone is still seeing increases, which is really terrific. The other thing that they go on to say is that news is no longer the top revenue genre. So news has been the top genre since 2018. And obviously with the pandemic, news was really a big deal. All the political, unrest and things that have been going on, I'm sure push people to news as well, but that has changed. So that's kind of good to see, I think, in some ways. So right now, topping the charts are sports and then society and culture, comedy, followed by news. So news is still in the fourth spot in terms of where the revenue is coming from a genre perspective. So I thought that was interesting. Now, in terms of key developments that they're seeing within the podcast ad space, programmatic buying is expected to grow. That's something that we've talked about certainly on this podcast. My anticipation is that programmatic will continue to grow, and there are lots of reasons why programmatic is growing. Number one, obviously, it's a simplified way of buying. Number two, you can do the targeting that a lot of advertisers are looking for. And number three, the cost is going to be lower than those host-read ads. So I think that is certainly something that we're just going to continue to see. The hope is obviously that the ad tech will progress and grow at the same pace that the demand for programmatic is increasing. So I feel like those are a couple of things we need to really watch. There's also advancements in brand safety. So I know that we've had brand safety conversations here on the show. I'm excited because we do have a nice interview coming up, I believe in July, from Oxford Road and Barometer talking about brand safety and brand suitability. So you can expect to hear that on the horizon here. But brand safety advancements really create a safer place for advertisers to place their dollars. So that's really important. They say that one of the key developments is the rise of the attention economy, and essentially podcast advertising is expected to further their interest in ad buying because they're looking to reach consumers who are highly engaged and lean into the content that they're consuming. I find that a little bit funny because I feel like, is this really a rise in the attention economy? We've had a high level of engagement, and I don't see that as being a new thing. Maybe that's a sustaining piece, right? That advertisers are realizing that they can reach podcast listeners on podcasts where they couldn't reach those people elsewhere. So I do see that as being a point, but I find that kind of interesting that they said that was a key piece, because that's something that's, been there for a really long time. So that kind of wrapped the study up. And to be honest, I was really surprised. I opened it up and I was looking for more. So typically the studies encompass quite a bit more. This year's study was only 22 pages long. And at the end of it, they said, hey, keep an eye out for part B, part 2 that's coming here soon. Last year's report was 36 pages long. And I kind of made a list of some of the different things that they had included in last year's report that were left out of this report. So last year, they reported on revenue by delivery method, whether that was baked in or dynamic. They reported on revenue by ad placement, so pre, post, mid. They reported on revenue ad type, whether it was announcer read or host read, spot length, revenue by pricing model, CPM versus flat, buy type. So whether that was annual buy, quarterly buy, or remnant buy. Revenue by direct response or branding, and then podcast ad spend effectiveness solutions used. And there were a few others as well that I didn't list, but I felt like those were the most substantial. And so for me, to be honest, this report really left me feeling a bit empty and wanting more, because I feel like these pieces that they left off are really key pieces. And I'm very hopeful that the report, that part B or part 2 that they're going to be releasing is going to have this information in it, because I think it's really important for us to look at those pieces. We can certainly see and know that programmatic is on the rise, but what are the other elements and how are the other elements affecting the overall revenue? For me, that's really the meat and the potatoes. I feel like it's great to say, oh, revenue is up. Yay, that's terrific. Revenue is expected to continue to grow. That's terrific. It's nice to see the genre information, but it felt a little bit empty. So hopeful that we're going to have more. And when we do see more, we certainly will bring it to you here on this program. So thank you for listening to the episode today. And I hope that you found it fascinating, as I did, because, it's just interesting stuff. You can certainly download this report for yourself. We will put a link in the show notes, but you can also just go to IAB 2023 Podcast Ad Revenue Report. Just Google that and you can find a link to it very easily if you would like to take a closer look for yourself. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. And if you want more information about podcast advertising, be sure to head on over to heatherosgood.com or truenativemedia.com, and I will catch you in the next episode. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.